Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Intro to Psych. Today, we're going to cover Chapter 5 Learning. So, when we think about what we mean by learning, we think about this as a kind of an obvious thing. But when we talk about this with psychology, we're going to be very specific and define two specifically different types of learning: non associative and associative learning. The majority of this lecture will be based around the two types of associative learning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but we will cover some other stuff later. So, when we discuss this idea of learning, we mean any enduring changes in behavior or knowledge that occur with our perception and conscious experience. That's a very vague definition, right? What does that exactly mean? Well, what we mean by that is any info that moves from our short term memory to our long term memory, something we'll talk about in a later chapter. And this can be something very, very simple, recognizing that, you know, uh, mosquitoes are bad, to, very complex thing, understanding how the nervous system works. Well, we can learn through two patterns of learning: non associative and associative learning. So, to quickly discuss this idea of non associative learning, these are relatively permanent changes in responses to a single stimulus caused by repeated exposure. So, you can imagine that when you put your shirt on for the day, you might notice that you have a shirt on for a moment, but eventually you forget about it. If you have glasses, you might have been in the situation where you forgot that your glasses were on your face. You have changed your response to that stimulus, your glasses are on your face or what have you. We can adapt or have our senses adapt an increased response to a stimulus after repeated exposure. So in this case, we can adapt to hot or cold water after spending some time in it. So we might, eventually get over that feeling. This is something that occurs in the brain. Now, compare that to this idea of habituation. Habituation is slowing the response to the repeated exposure of this. For instance, if you put up a scarecrow, crows are going to learn to not go there. But over time, they might eventually return, realizing that it's not something as scary. If you are trying a food that you've really, really liked in the past and you've had it a couple times now, it might not taste as good as it used to, right? And this is something that is happening right in the body in terms of that, not necessarily in terms of perception. So that's non associative learning. What is associative learning then? Well, this is learning by association, learning how two pieces of information are related to one another. How we learn that a good smell probably means that food is ready. And two types of learning are classical conditioning, here, where we learn the relationship between a stimulus and an involuntary response. We learn that when we see the doctor holding a shot, we know that, oh, this is going to hurt, right? We've learned that that's a painful experience and that the thing that's coming is going to cause that painful experience. And this is Ivan Pavlov type thinking here, which we'll discuss in a moment. But compare that to operant conditioning, where we're learning this voluntary relationship between a behavior and a consequence. This idea that you might learn if you practice really hard, you win a reward, or if you study for an exam, you're going to do well. And this is B.F. Skinner, who talks about this type operant conditioning. So, with this in mind, let's start with this idea of Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning. So, originally, Pavlov was I don't want to get this wrong, a physiologist, not a physicist. He's a physiologist, and he was studying the digestive tracts of dogs. How do dogs digest things? And what he learned was that over time, when he or his assistants were coming in to feed the dogs would hear the squeaky door or the bell, whatever it was, um, make a noise. And the dogs eventually associated that with food is coming. right? So this is just associating one thing with another. And so there's a lot of terms we can discuss here, right? And they are broken down into stimuli and responses. So think about this in terms of getting inputs and doing outputs. Stimuli are any type of inputs we get from the environment. If you smell a very good smell while you're at home, you probably know that that means dinner is ready, right? And so your response to that is to go check it out, eat dinner. Now, you can have unlearned stimuli and responses. So, unlearned stimuli are going to be things that always elicit the same unlearned response. So, if you go smell the trash, right, that stinky smell, you have an unconditioned and automatic response. It smells bad. Compare that to conditioned responses and conditioned stimuli. These are going to be things where we learn the relationship between two different things and how that relationship works, right? We learn the relationship that a bell in the Pavlov example, which is previously a neutral stimulus, which didn't mean anything for the dogs, comes to be associated with food time. So another example, or kind of a list here of all of our classical conditioning terms and some examples are here below. But again, the way that classical conditioning works is we are associating one thing with another. So we are associating an unconditioned stimulus. When dogs smell food, they are going to start to salivate. They're going to start to get hungry and get ready to eat. They don't have to learn this. This is something natural. If you are hungry and you smell food, your body is going to automatically respond this way. Now, before conditioning, right, the first day that we bring dogs into the lab, they're going to hear this bell or this squeaky door or whatever. They don't know what that means. They haven't associated that link together yet. So what happens next is, well, we take some time. We have the bell happen, food comes, and eventually, right, the dog is going to salivate because food is related to salivation. Eventually, though, after enough pairings, the dog learns to skip this food step. The dog learns that the bell means that food's coming, which means get hungry. So a couple examples of this here, right, showing you how food is an unconditioned stimulus causing the unconditioned response of salivation. You'll notice, though, that the bell goes from a neutral stimulus when we are conditioning the dog to a conditioned stimulus because it's a learned response now. When the bell hits or rings, we do something. We've learned to do something. So notice that salivation as well, getting your mouth full of saliva is going to be a conditioned response. It is a learned response because it's no longer linked to just food. It's linked to this bell. Now, another example you could imagine, right, is imagine that you are in a class where you have a really mean professor there. And so you know originally that you don't like mean people. You're afraid of mean people, generally, right? And so you don't know anything about this class in particular. So on your first day, you show up to class and you don't feel afraid. You don't feel anything because it's just a day of class. However, imagine that I'm the meanest professor ever. I'm constantly being rude. And so, right, what is happening is you are going to class and I am acting rude and causing you fear. So what happens after a week of classes? Well, you get afraid of coming to class. Why? Because you know what's going to happen at class. You've associated those things together. Now, how many pairings does it actually take to associate these things? Well, like most things in life, it depends. However, if these are paired closer in time, this is going to be better. And if these stimuli are more motivating than others, the difference between giving you a piece of candy and giving you $100, right? That's going to differ on this. Now, one famous example of classical conditioning is the Little Albert study by John Watson. So John Watson wanted to see if we could create a phobia, a fear of in a child. And so what he did was he basically classically conditioned a little baby called little Albert to fear a rabbit. So the quote I've put on the screen here is not an actual quote from him, but it is a kind of idealized quote of him. And the idea that John Watson was getting at here was, is it the case where your nature doesn't really matter, where it's, where it's more your nurture? Can I train you to be whatever I want? Can I train you to be afraid of something? And so what is going to happen is we are going to see that if we scare a young child by pairing a white rat, which originally the kid doesn't care about the rat, that every time he sees this rat, we make a really loud noise. Eventually, the child learns this rat is causing me fear. It turns out you only need to do this 6 times to cause this 9-month-old to fear rats. Now, there's a lot of unethical issues with this experiment, one of which is we don't necessarily know if little Albert was ever conditioned of this. However, some recent research has suggested that one person who may have been little Albert didn't necessarily like pets, but he wasn't necessarily totally afraid of them either. And so you can see here how that conditioning works. Now, it's important to note that little Albert was afraid of rats, but he wasn't afraid of rabbits. He wasn't afraid of all white things. He wasn't afraid of all fluffy things. It turns out little Albert learned that it's not every white fluffy thing, it's just rats. So this is the idea of being able to either generalize or discriminate against different stimuli. So for instance, if you are at school and the bell rings, you are going to get up and leave, right? This being high school in this example. Now, what happens if the bell has a different sound than usual? Well, you're probably still going to get up and leave, right? You're going to generalize to other objects. So little Albert didn't do this. Little Albert was afraid of rats, but he wasn't afraid of other white fluffy things. He didn't generalize this fear to something else. He discriminated this fear. He responded differently to this noise than a different this object than a different object. And so you can imagine, how this plays a role as well, that sometimes people generalize to fear this situation in multiple places or discriminate to only look at it in one particular space. Now, with classical condition, we can reverse this. It's not like it's something that's just learned, right? We can also remove it. So, for instance, if my dog is constantly begging because I stopped giving her treats, it's going to take a while, but eventually she's going to learn that there's no treats. So it's not necessarily erasing the conditioned response, it's just removing that response. Because if I were to, after not giving my dog a treat for a month, give her a treat, she would recondition herself. She would immediately start begging for treats again because she would spontaneously recover this. It would reappear after it was extinct. This is the same way that we might feel a certain way after we've smelled a smell for a long time, or feel a certain way after we see an old friend, right? That feeling that we've had has come back. What's really cool about conditioning is we can take these steps and chunk them together, right? For instance, if it's not just that my cat knows that I'm going to give her food at a certain time, or, I'm going to give her food if I open this specific drawer. My cat knows that if I walk towards this specific drawer, then I'm going to open that drawer and give her food. And so we are able to chain together these conditioned stimuli to help us to better understand our world. Some uses of classical conditioning our taste aversion. So our bodies are very aversive to when we feel sick, food poisoning, for instance. It's this biopreparedness idea that if you have gotten sick of food poisoning from something, for instance, it was Campbell's chicken noodle soup for me, you might never want to eat it again. So we talked about how you can give people phobias with classical conditioning, but more importantly, you can remove people's phobias with classical conditioning by desensitizing them, by giving them in small doses and working from kind of small to large or large to small steps in which by which they overcome their fear. So in this case, if you are arachnophobic, fearing spiders, the first step is not going to put you in a room and have you hold a spider. The first step might be to systematically desensitize, remove the sensitivity slowly through a system by putting you in a room with a picture of a spider, like a drawing of a spider, and seeing how you feel. And maybe at the beginning you're really stressed out, but by the end of the session you feel better. After a couple sessions, maybe we have you just hold a picture of a spider. Going to looking, seeing a fake spider, to holding a fake spider, to being in the room with a real spider, to eventually maybe being able to hold a real spider. That we can systematically desensitize you by relearning those links. And this is something you may have done with your dog. If one of your dogs was maybe fearful of another dog in the house, you might slowly but surely introduce them to one another so that they learn over time, hey, we're not actually going to fight. So that was a lot, but that covers this idea of classical conditioning. So from here, we're going to move on to an entirely different type of conditioning. So make sure you're being aware of that. So this idea of operant conditioning here comes from this law of effect with Thorndike here. Thorndike studied animals' intelligence, and he wanted to see how animals were able to solve problems. And so to do this, he would put animals, in this case cats, in a box. And in this box was a lever that cats could push, just like you would push the lever, your gas lever on your car, and that would open up this door and the cat could escape. The cat could come get a treat if they wanted to. And we wanted to see how animals were learning, because what you notice is that the first couple times an animal does this, they don't really know what they're doing. However, right, eventually they'll stumble along, they'll hit the lever and they'll open up the box and they'll go, oh, cool. And over time, these cats get really good at this, to the point where you can put the cat in the box and within 1 or 2 seconds, the cat goes, yeah, I know how to get out of here, and gets out of here. Well, this is the idea that if a behavior is repeated, the consequences of behavior are going to affect whether or not you do that behavior. If you get rewarded for doing something, you're going to do it again. If you get punished for doing something, you're not going to do it. So Thorndike's ideas were taken by a guy named B.F. Skinner here, and we formalize this as operational conditioning or operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is going to be just learning our consequences of our behavior is going to affect what we do in the future. You may have heard Skinner's name in this idea of Skinner boxes, this idea that if we train an animal to do a behavior and we give them a reward for it, they're going to learn how to do it faster and faster. That if every time this mouse presses the lever when a light turns on, and give him a reward, he's going to learn how to do this very quickly. Note how this differs from classical conditioning, where classical conditioning are involuntary responses, how you involuntarily react to something. Operant conditioning is voluntary behaviors here. And so with that, it's how our rewards and punishments affect our next time of doing a behavior. So we can think about rewards and punishments in 2 different ways each. So rewarding people for behavior, reinforcing people for behavior is something we want to do. If you do something good, we want you to do it again. How can I reward you for doing well on an exam? Well, I can give you something. I can give you good grades, right? As the professor. What happens if you are in high school? How can your parents reward you for good grades? Well, they can give you some money. They can, uh, you know, add something, give you something. This is the idea of a positive reinforcer. So, positive in this case is not good, and negative is not bad. Positive is adding something. So, I can positively reinforce your behavior of doing good on an exam by, uh, you know, giving you money. If I'm your parent, hey, congrats, you did really good this semester. Here's some money. And that's going to make you think, I want to do this again. As your parent, which I'm not, I could always, if you do have really good grades, I can say, guess what? You don't have to do all of the chores you don't want to because you did so well. Or I can say, you can stay up later, right? So I can remove something from whatever you do to make you want to do this again. On the other hand, what happens if you get a bad grade? Well, I probably want to punish you if you're my kid. And how am I going to do that? Well, I could add something that you don't like to make you less likely to do this. I could do a positive punishment. Remember, positive ain't good in this case. I could hit you. I could scream at you. I could make you do more chores. That would be a way to get you to theoretically not do the bad thing again. But is that going to work? Well, we'll talk about that later. Finally, a negative punishment, the idea of removing a pleasant stimulus. So if you get bad grades, we will take away your ability to go out. We will ground you. Or, we will take away your phone. Something like this is going to be a negative punishment, removing something to punish you. So a way to think about this in any given example I could give you, imagine that you have a dog that eventually learns on a choke leash that every time they pull forward, it hurts. Right? So, in the example, is pulling forward and hurting this dog going to increase the behavior? No, it's going to be a punisher, right? Because it is going to hopefully tell the dog, don't pull or you will get choked. So, was the consequence removed after the target behavior? So, was it the pain removed or was the pain added? Well, the pain was added, so it wasn't removed. So this is a positive punishment. So we're focusing on what happens after the response, where reinforcements are, if there's a good consequence, we want to do it more, but punishments are if there's a bad consequence. So for instance, I can reinforce you by if I respond very nicely when you answer questions in class, I'm probably going to make you more likely to answer questions. On the other hand, if I yell at you every time you answer questions, I act very rudely, it's going to be a punishment. It's less likely that you'll do this again. Now, as we mentioned, it's important to recognize that positive doesn't mean good, because yelling at you or being kind to you is a positive reinforcer or punisher, depending. If I hit you, that is a positive punishment, but that doesn't sound good here. On the other hand, negative doesn't mean bad. Certainly, a negative punishment might be taking away your phone, but a negative reinforcer, if you take a medication when you have a headache, it makes the headache go away. So this can be a negative reinforcer. Now, two special types of negative reinforcement I want to bring up here are escape conditioning and avoidance conditioning. And so escape conditioning is going to be when there is a negative thing around here, and so your response is to get out of there, to leave. So if you go to a party and somebody you really don't like is there, an ex, right? And you have you're negatively, you just don't like them. You are going to turn around and leave the party. And what's going to happen when you're leaving? That is going to reward you. It's going to say, oh, Thank goodness. I know I can leave now, and I like not being here. So you might learn how to escape these situations. On the other hand, you might also now avoid future situations so you can avoid that punishment. You don't want to go to the party because that person might be there. So, recognizing how escape and avoidance are also two negative reinforcing behaviors. But to kind of bring this home, right, I think about how important this is with raising children and training animals. They're a lot more of the same thing than you'd expect. But right, when I want to potty train my daughter, I can give her candy every time she potties, positively reinforce her. She thinks if I do this again, I'll get a reward. I can reward her by letting her stay up a couple extra minutes after bedtime, taking away a bad thing so she does it again. If she doesn't potty, I could punish her, right? If she potties in her pants, I could hit her. I could yell at her, don't do this, right? This is bad. Or, I could theoretically take away her toys. And I could say, you went potty in your pants, you didn't go potty on the potty. I'm going to take something you want away from you. The funny thing about this is she trains me just like I train her. Imagine, right? I am waiting for dinner to finish up, and my daughter starts freaking out and says, I want candy, I want candy. Well, I can give her candy, but what is she going to learn? She's going to learn that, well, if I complain, I'm going to get candy again. If I say, sweetheart, if you wait for dinner, if you calm down, I'll make it so that you don't have to eat your veggies. Taking away something bad so that you do it again, that's a negative reinforcer. I could, again, smack her, yell her, hit her because she's having a tantrum. And what is she going to learn? I won't do this, but it's not healthy. And finally, I could also take away her toys. If you keep screaming or you keep screaming, I'm going to take away your toys. She's going to hopefully learn that she shouldn't do that again. But it's to make this point that this works both ways. We are being trained by those who are training us. You might ask, which type of reinforcement is the best? Well, it's positive, or I should say, which schedule of reinforcement is the best? It is positive reinforcement. The idea is that you've gotten a reward for doing this, and if you do it again, you'll get another reward. If I give you an A for doing well on the exam, you're hopefully going to do it again to get another A. On the other hand, negative punishment, taking away something because they did something bad, is going to be the least effective because you're just going to try to not get caught, right? The idea is that you may get punished, and what you're learning here is that if I don't get caught, there's nothing bad. If you have siblings and you've ever had to pull the please don't tell mom card, this is that idea here. Now, do recognize with both types of conditioning here, we don't just do a one and done thing. It's not like I look at my daughter and I just say, now, go potty on the potty. We do shaping just in the same way you shape a sculpture with clay. You kind of start with this big overall goal and break it into small components. So the first goal might be just having my daughter go into the bathroom if she has to pee. And then eventually saying, now we're going to change into from diapers into something else. So that way that you have to go into the bathroom to do this. And so this is the way that we can train dolphins or something to jump through hoops. It's not like we just put the hoop up and wait until the dolphin jumps through it. We can teach them by first giving them the ability to get a reward for just swimming through the hoop underwater. And then they learn, oh, when I swim through the hoop, that's good. Then we put the hoop out of water and they kind of jump just a little and they say, oh, that's good, before we put it all the way up in the air. So if you've gotten through to this part, congratulations. I have one more level to confuse you with. When we talk about reinforcers, specifically positive reinforcers, we can think about what we mean by reinforcers. So we can talk about unconditioned reinforcers, things that are unlearned, very rewarding to us. I like having air. I like breathing. And breathing is a good thing. Eating is a good thing. Sleeping is a good thing. And pain is a bad thing. And so I know very simply those things as good or bad. However, we also have secondary reinforcers. For instance, money, right? We work for money. Money is important, but I can't eat money. I trade money for food. So money is a secondary reinforcer. It's a learned reinforcer here. So it's something we have learned that has value, right? A negative reinforcement might be removing a registration hold. That's going to be something that makes you feel good, or helps you to do something, but it's not something that naturally you are born with an instinct to avoid registration holds. With all of that, let's take into account how often are we actually going to reinforce you. So let's only now focus on positive reinforcement. So giving you rewards when you do something good. Think about training a dog. Should I give my dog a reward every time she sits? Should I give her a reward every 10 times she sits? Should I give her a reward randomly? So we can talk about this in terms of how we decide to give those reinforcements. And there's 4 different ways, words that we can use to talk about this that work into 4 different schedules of reinforcement. So the first type of reinforcement that we're going to talk about are ratios versus intervals. Ratios are going to be the number of times that you do something. So if I give you money for licking every 100 stamps on an envelope, or putting 100 a stamp on 100 envelopes, and I only pay you after you've reached 100, but I pay you every time you've done 100, that's going to be what we call a fixed ratio, because it's going to depend on the ratio, the number of times, but it's going to be fixed. The same kind of requirements are going to be for each. Compare that to intervals, right? An interval variable. If I were to give you a pop quiz, you don't necessarily know how long it's going to be until I give you a pop quiz, and you don't know when it is going to happen, right? It's after a specific amount of time, and the requirement varies here. These are going to be different. So if we put all of these together, a fixed ratio schedule is going to be something that happens after a number of responses. Every 100 pieces of material you make, you get paid for. We can do fixed interval. Every 2 weeks, you get paid, right? So after a fixed period of time, 2 weeks, say in this case, you get your reward. Or, right, your birthday is a fixed interval. It happens once every year. On the other hand, we can talk about variable schedules of reinforcement, variable ratio. So thinking about a slot machine is a great example of a variable ratio. A slot machine, it doesn't matter how long it takes between the pulls of the slot machine. It matters how many times the slot machine has, been played. This is going to be a random number, variable. Sometimes the slot machine can hit back-to-back jackpots. Probably not. Sometimes it won't. Lastly, variable interval, we deliver this reinforcer after a random amount of time has passed. If you're fishing here, it's not like it's the amount of casts that you send out, it's how long the fish, how long the lure is in the water. So these 2 types, right, continuous versus partial reinforcement, actually differ in how effective they are. It turns out that if you want people to do things and learn over time, you actually want them to do a variable type, and depends on what you want. If you want them to learn, for instance, you might do a variable interval, a pop quiz here. If I want you to just get through things as fast as you want, I might do a fixed ratio. Now, one thing that happens here, though, is that sometimes we get into this partial reinforcement effect. That, sometimes we have a random connection with something. Maybe it's the case where we see a black cat and something bad happens. Or Michael Jordan, for instance, had a superstition that he had to wear his UNC practice shorts under his Bulls jersey because he thought it was lucky. Why? Because he probably did it once and it did make him win in that. And he felt like this is something he had to keep doing. This relates to what we were talking about earlier with extinction bursts that also happen with operant conditioning. In this case, right, when we are no longer getting rewarded or punished for what we did, we might stop or redo it again. If you get a reward every time you put money in a vending machine, and all of a sudden, for the last 2 times, the vending machine has taken your money and not done anything, you're going to stop putting your money in. However, eventually, you might see that the vending machine is working and you decide to try it again. So do note, a big portion of this lecture is the difference between classical and operant conditioning. How one, Pavlovian, or in this case classical, is going to be related to involuntary stimuli and responses, whereas operant is related to voluntary stimuli and responses, voluntary actions and outcomes. So as we said, it's important to note that while we've just gone through these 2 major types of learning, there's other types of learning that maybe fit more of our definition of learning. Because, right, for a chapter on learning, sure doesn't feel like we spent a lot of time about why we have to memorize things. But there's a lot of other ways we learn that aren't just rewards and punishments. Well, when we think about this is because we've talked about behaviorism, which is not really interested at all in the conscious role of this. Everything we've talked about today has been without thinking about what's going on in the brain, just giving people rewards, giving people punishments, and seeing what they do. However, there's obviously stuff going on up here in your head. How do we get to that? Well, let's talk about some of that type of learning. We can talk about latent learning, the idea that we will learn from our environment even if we're not necessarily rewarded or punished. So in a study by Edward Tolman, we looked at 3 different groups of rats who were asked to solve a maze. The first group was given food from the beginning whenever they reached the maze. The second group wasn't given any food for the first 10 days of running this maze. On the 11th day, we started giving them food for running the maze. In the third group, we have the control group, where nobody ever gets a reward for running the maze, not on the 11th day, not on the 20th day. So look at the first 10 days. What do we see here? Well, with the food group, there is clearly some extra learning going on. These individuals are learning because they're being rewarded for it. Yeah, that's what we expect. But once we start giving food to the delayed group, they all of a sudden do really, really well. What does this suggest? Well, this suggests that we have what are called cognitive maps. We have mental representations of our environment. You don't have to be rewarded or punished to learn the area that you live in, where you go, how to get back to it. That's something that we just learn naturally. Another way we learn is by watching people, observational learning. A very famous study called the Bobo doll study had children come in and watch a woman model here, just an adult, play with this Bobo character. Bobo is this weebly wobbly kind of weird looking clown. And what we find is that when we ask kids to just go play with Bobo, some of them will beat up Bobo, they'll hit Bobo. But if children watch this adult model beat up Bobo, the children will do the same thing. And if they watch a person do it versus watching a cartoon or even somebody on screen, they're more likely to do this. What does this tell us about learning? Well, we learn by modeling and observational learning. We learn by watching what other people do and doing it, right? Imitating what people do. We also learn by observing, watching others' behaviors. If you've ever been at a Chinese restaurant and you don't know how to use chopsticks, you might look towards your friends and you might see what they're doing. And that might help you to figure out how to hold the chopsticks. Another way we can talk about this is vicarious conditioning. So, vicarious through someone else. This is the idea of learning the consequences of our actions by watching what somebody else does. For instance, if you have a sibling who swears and mom comes along and yells at them or puts soap in your mouth, you don't have to have that happen to you for you to learn what is going on. You learn by watching other people. So there's this great video of observational learning in action, which you can go ahead and look at with the slides. But to kind of finish off beyond that, we can talk about this idea of insight learning. This is the next to last thing we talk about, is the fact that sometimes it's just out of nowhere. If you've ever had a situation where you have been trying to figure out the answer for a couple days and it just all of a sudden appears, it's having this insight, it seems to come from nowhere. Final type of non-associative learning that we can talk about here that is also important is this learned helplessness. And it's kind of related to some of what we've discussed already, but it's this idea that over time, you may learn, you may gain this kind of pattern of learning that says, oh, I can't control the bad things that happen to me, so why even try? And this is going to have a lot of impact on a person's life. And is actually related to two different types of intelligence. This idea of, do you think that the world, or do you think that your abilities are something that can grow and change, or are you somebody who thinks that you never are able to change? It's important to note that that is also going to affect this idea of learned helplessness. But with that, I've gone and covered pretty much everything there is to cover about Chapter 5 in learning. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.